Good morning and welcome to Ask the Agronomist. I'm Laura Cunningham and I have two special guests today that are going to help us dive into our topic, which is what is the optimal planting depth for corn? So before we dive in though, Lyle, how about you introduce yourself and share a little bit about your role at Latham Seeds?
Hi, everyone. Lyle Marcus. I'm the corn product manager at Latham High Tech Seeds. I joined the company about a year and a half ago. This is my first opportunity to do that Ask the Agronomist video. So glad to be with the group and look forward to sharing some useful information on tips for planting corn this spring.
Okay, thanks, Lyle. Bob, how about we have you do the same? Why don't you introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your role at Latham?
Yeah, hi, everybody. I work with Lyle and John and Mark kind of in the background to work on access for germplasm and products that we put in the lineup and development of products and profiling and agreements and try to expand our base of where we access products from and products we develop in-house. So that's kind of my role in a nutshell.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, guys. Back to our topic then. Every year we get several questions about optimal seeding depth. Lyle, I know last season you kind of put some of this thinking to the test in a research study. Do you want to tell us a little bit about how you set up that trial and then what your goals were for the study?
Yeah, so like you said, every year we get growers asking us questions, what's optimal planting depth? Where should I be planting my corn? How shallow can I go? Or, how deep is too deep? And when we look at the history of looking at corn, from universities to all the agronomy people out in the world that like to look at corn, we really need to identify how that root system works. The corn has two systems of roots. It has its nodal root system, and then it develops brace roots, which come later in the season. That nodal root system is a key for everything that happens throughout the season in that corn plant. If we don't get that system established correctly in the soil profile, we can cause some problems with crop development and overall yield. So what I did last spring is Phil and I worked together at the Latham Research Farm there, and we only took one hybrid last year. We're going to expand it a little bit this year. We planted it at 3 depths. We planted it at about an inch and a half, tried to shoot for that target. And then we planted about 2 3/4, shooting for a 2.5 inch depth. And then we tried to stick it in the ground as deep as we could and shot for a 3+ planting depth. And then in the fall, we went out and did some root digs on those some individual plants and pulled the ears off of those to show where the root system developed within the soil profile and the effect that had on ear development. And what we found, and this is posted on our dealer center, and our dealers and our RSMs have access to this, and I think Laura's going to show you the pictures here in a little bit. But what we found is that shallow planting depth on the flex-eared hybrid of 5245 that we used, we only achieved 16 kernel rows on that ear. And we can see that the top set of nodal roots, there's 5 sets of nodal roots in a plant. The top set was actually out of the soil profile. So when it's out of the soil profile, it's subject to damage from sunlight or herbicide and some of those kind of things, and causes that portion of the root system to be less effective. When we looked at the 2.5 inch planting depth, we added 2 rows of grain, and we added about an 1.5 inches of length to the ear as well. And we end up with a much more uniform ear size, deeper kernels, a lot more yield potential, and a great anchor system to hold that plant up throughout the season. When we look at the 3 inch depth, we saw a similar ear to the 2.5 inch depth. So we maintained the 18 kernel rows, we maintained the length, we maintained the kernel depth, and we also maintained that strong root structure that held the plant up well. So sometimes we talk about planting depth and we want to get the crop up early, and we say we should plant it shallow, it'll emerge quicker. That can be variable depending upon what moisture you have in that top portion of the soil profile. Plus, then also you can potentially have this damage occur to your nodal root system, which reduces yield potential, anchoring system, all the things that are important for that plant to uptake moisture, nutrients, and everything it needs to be most successful. So My recommendation is always shoot for 2.5, 2 3/4 inch planting depth. Bob has talked many times to the group about how moist soil profile when you plant, right after you plant, that soil dries out. And what happens to soil when it's wet? It expands, and when it dries, it shrinks back down. So at a 2.5, 2 3/4 inch planting depth and a nice, what we'd like to see, a nice moist soil in the springtime at planting, can easily shrink down a 1/2 inch after you plant and get some heat and some temperature on it. So shoot for that 2.5, 2 3/4 inch planting depth every year, no matter what conditions you are. We'll talk about that in a little bit here, but that's really the target that I like to see, and most agronomy people will talk to you about that target level.
Okay, interesting. That's a good segue too. So, Bob, a question for you then. There's a lot of areas across the Midwest that are going to be variable this spring. We've got areas that are really, really dry. We've got areas that are more on the wet side. What recommendations do you have then on planting depth when there's, moisture variables in the mix?
Yeah, well, it's good. I think the study shows a lot of what we'll kind of talk about and the reasons why those effects came out. Lyle pointed out that the shallow planting exposed the upper nodal roots to heat penetration. And really, when you see the picture that you put up later, there's a crown that we'll want to point out on that. And that crown is where all those nodal roots come from. And I always refer to that crown as kind of like the radiator for the corn plant. And the closer to the surface we get that, if we plant too shallow and it gets closer than 1.5 inches to the surface, it picks up all that heat. And anybody that's walked soybeans for their dad back in school to make that, what was it, Lyle, 25 cents an hour?
Yeah,
like that.
Exactly.
Your feet get hot when the ground's dry, and your feet don't get hot when the ground's moist. And I think that is what the crown roots are going through. And so depth is critical. More important that we get depth right to protect the crowns is that we get every kernel in moisture so that we have uniform emergence. Last fall during the harvest talks, we referred to this about a 72-hour emergence window. Plants that all come up from the first plant that comes up to 90% of the plants up in that 72-hour zone is critical to maximum yield. There's a lot of charts and a lot of graphs that we can look at that will show planting date in the United States as an average versus overall yield in the United States overall average. And it's interesting that after we get to April 23rd through May 7th is when our high yields have always occurred in the United States. And it goes right with soil temperature, right? Warmer soils in that period than planting on April 15th gives us more uniform emergence. I think what we don't understand a lot of times is that when you have an 80,000 kernels in a bag and you see a 95% germ in a bag, every one of those kernels is a living item except for the 5%. And those 95% are all dying as they age. That's what kernels of grass seed, alfalfa seed, soybean seed do. They're all dying at a different rate is more important. And so there's weaker seeds and stronger seeds. And we put them in cold soils. They come up at different rates, and that weakness, those weaknesses become exposed and we get variable. So we just say, well, add more kernels, add more plants. But one of the more critical things we can do is to get to moisture. And so Lyle's talking about moisture. And so we have these little planting sticks, and everybody says, well, I'm a double knuckle guy. Lyle, put your finger up. I don't think your double knuckle and my double knuckle are the same.
Nope, mine's a little bit longer.
A credit card is simple to use because I can carry it. And I started doing this because I can't take those depth guides on an airplane, when I go around the country. So this is 2 inches here. So when you're planting at 2-inch depth, now Lyle, you're saying 2.5 to 2 3/4, and I completely agree with you. But a lot of guys have been taught 1.5, 1 3/4. And if we can just say, let's get to 2 inches before we start, worrying about too much, you have to bury this credit card in the V channel, level with the firm soil. You sweep away all of the trash, and you get to firm soil, and then 2 inches. That's how deep that is. So if you can't bury a credit card in there, you're not even 2 inches deep. And that's at the top of the kernel, not at the bottom of the kernel. And the kernel's a 1/4 inch sometimes, depending on how it lands. So you can't cheat the system. What happens is when we get out to the field and everybody gets in a hurry, the farmer comes down, he picks up the planter, he turns around, he goes 5 feet, he stops and goes back and checks his depth. Well, his speed was the slowest in that 5 feet than he planted probably that whole last pass. And that planter is setting with the most pressure down. You need to get out, get some speed up where you're going to plant, because planter will rise. And it will rise more on wet soil than it will rise on dry soil. And you're setting at 2 inches or 2.5 inches on the end of that field isn't what you're going to get out in the middle of the field. So you want to sample your depth with proper speed all over the field, not always just on the same end, because if we can get to this 2.5 inches, you'll take care of all the variable moisture that goes along in the field, where it's lighter soil in the back or heavier soil in the middle. And that's a very nice happy medium for safety for that corn kernel to always be in proper placement. So dry soil, you want to sweep away the trash on top that's not affecting you, get to firm, and then get at least 2 inches and shoot for that 2.5 inch zone, so that there's moist soil over the top of the kernel pressing down on it. When you're in wet soil, as Lyle said, soil swells. So it's just like when we plant in wet soil with a V channel and our closing wheels close that up, and then the sun comes out and bakes it, and all of a sudden that channel starts open and you can see the kernel down in that channel. If you turn that sideways and you know that you've got moist ground and you put in your kernel at 2 inches, when this soil dries out, your kernel will stay the same, but the soil will start to go down. And all of a sudden, you're not kerneled at 2 inches. You might be kerneled at 1 inch. And those crowns are. And so I always say, when you're planting in moist soils, and it's usually because it's late in the season, because nobody would plant in moist soils early. When you plant in moist soils, you need to plant deeper, because when that dries out, that corn kernel is going to be shallower than where you placed it. And so I think it's really a critical area that these moist soil guys get in almost as much trouble as the dry soil guys. One gets to moisture, but he doesn't get deep enough to have moisture later. And one doesn't get it to deep enough moisture to be uniform and consistent across the season's profile.
Yeah, I would add, if you take the two extremes, right? Severe dry soil, some of the guys are concerned this spring about the drought from last year, and some of those factors are coming into springtime, and how deep should I plant? You should try and reach moisture. Okay, you got two options. You can wait for a rain, which isn't always the most ideal thing to do, because you don't know when that's going to come or what kind of delays that could cause later. But you should always try and search for moisture. The key is to minimize your moisture loss as you prep that field. So don't work it too deep. Don't work it too many times. Do the minimal amount of tillage that you can in the springtime, and then search for moisture. That could be 2, 3/4. It could even be 3 inches. Find moisture, because if you set that kernel, all the kernels are set in moisture together, you'll get that uniform emergence. When you plant in a dry soil and you go shallow, you have all the kernels sitting in dry dirt. And so then it's dependent upon when moisture reaches them. Sometimes moisture will wick up from the bottom as you firm over with your planter. Moisture will wick up and come up and might touch the bottom of some of those kernels, and they'll emerge. Or you're waiting for moisture to come down from the top in a rainfall, and you can get a lot of unevenness. And like Bob said, that 72-hour period from the time the first one comes out of the ground, spikes through, to get 95% of them all to emerge within 72 hours is the optimum way to maximize yield. So, and then like Bob said, on the wet side too, right? The closing the furrow is the most important piece. So if you're planting on a little wetter soil, make sure that your closing wheels are doing the right job. Go through, I saw a video, and we're going to do some fun stuff this spring after planting passes. I saw a cool video on how to look at that. Everybody has a leaf blower. After you do a planting pass, stop, and in your full speed planting pass, so go, halfway across the field, stop, and then don't check behind the planter. Check the pass to the left or right of where you were, because that's your actual speed at planting time. Take your leaf blower and blow the soil off of the seed row. You can see the trench. And depending upon the closing wheel style and the soil condition, you can see a lot of variability. And to Bob's point, where with that, when that soil dries out, it shrinks. It not only shrinks going down, but that seed trench can open up too. So really watch that. It's a real key for us in keeping that seed to soil contact. The more we can keep that closed and tight, the moisture will wick up, and we'll have a much more uniform emergence in those situations. So always do your planter pass, stop out in the middle of the field and go off to the side and look at your previous pass to check your depth. That's really the best way to do it.
Yeah, it's really great. I'm going to add one thing to you. A lot of times when we're planting, we get these cooler nights. You started to mention this. Moisture comes up in the night. When the guy starts planting in the morning, he thinks he's in moisture. And so it's really good that nighttime, when you finish, you recognize where the thin soils were in that field that you just planted. Before you go home for the night, check that depth and see if you're still at the driest part of the day in good moisture, so that you know tomorrow morning whether I need to dump it down another notch, or however your planter adjusts. But that's a good way to know if you're just getting moisture touching the bottom and giving you false imbibition, where it starts and it stops and it starts and it stops, and pretty soon even the good seed starts to look pretty weak. So that's why we want to make sure we're covering the top of the soil with good, firmly packed, moist ground.
And the other recommendation is, check every field. Don't plant your first cornfield, set the planter, and say, I'm good to go for the rest of the year, right? You might be planting some fields corn on soybeans. You might have some cover crop out there. You might have some that are more minimum till, some are no till. Check every field individually and watch those fields that have a lot of variable soil types. If you have a field that has a sand pocket in it, for instance, and then there's some, more clay soils or loam soils on the other end of the field, be sure that you're watching that to get a happy medium, so you're getting the best in both places. It's hard to change depth on the fly with a planter to adjust for soils. So do the best you can to make sure you're hitting the happy medium to get the best planting depth in all the soils within that field. Yeah.
All right. Well, this has been a really great discussion. I appreciate the visuals too. That's a really easy way to check seed depth, and especially on the fly. Do you guys have anything else you want to leave our audience with as we wrap up today?
I think planter speed is everything. We all went out and got bigger planters, and then we increased our speed. And I think the planters was so that we could cover more ground without increasing the speed. But lift, it's like an airplane. The faster you go, the more lift you get on those machines. And when they bounce, now you're covering more distance before they set themselves back correctly, which is why we got all these down pressure springs and everything going on. And so these planters are meant to plant that kernel like it's the only kernel you're going to plant. And I think you need to stop and think about, every kernel I don't place right is one that I'm just throwing away that I spent pretty good money for, and it's not going to yield me anything. So kernel bounce is certainly an issue, but planter speed, great singulation, great spacing, and consistent depth control comes from 4 to 5 miles an hour, not faster.
Yeah. I would just add that we talk a lot about average farmer has 40 chances to plant a crop. Let's make 2021 one of your best chances, and to learn to go forward as you finish your career as a corn farmer, to think about planting. The most important part of making a corn crop, soybean crop, anything, is the planting pass. Whatever fertilizer you do to it, if you're irrigator, ever how much water you put to it, the herbicide program, all of those things are all secondary. It's all about the planting pass and making sure you're putting the seed in the right spot for its best success.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, both of you, Lyle and Bob, for lending your experience to our topic today on seed depth. Thanks to our viewers for joining us. If you have more questions on seed depth, visit lathamseeds.com and look for the tab called the field position. That's where we dock all of our articles and expertise from our staff at Latham. You can find more information on Lyle's seed depth study, including a video with more footage of what those results looked like, as well as other articles that might help answer some questions as you go to plant your crop this year. So thanks, everyone, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, Laura.
Thanks, everyone.